Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about the golden age of the Dutch Republic. So we've been studying absolutism, and now we're going to look at a few examples of places in Europe where they did not have absolutism and kind of look at the alternatives to absolutism. At the top of your notes, it talks about Dutch art. So there's a lot of Dutch art throughout this PowerPoint. As you view the PowerPoint, please write down notes on what you observe about the artwork. What do you notice about the style, the subject matter, the composition? What are these artworks showing, and what does that tell us about Dutch society during this time? So let's review a little bit about what we've already learned about the Netherlands and how the Netherlands became independent, because they were not under a monarchy, which was very different than the rest of Europe. So Spain ruled the Netherlands under the Habsburg ruler Charles V. You remember Charles V probably from the Protestant Reformation. He was also the Holy Roman Emperor. When Charles abdicated, he divided his territory between his two heirs. Philip II, one of his sons, became King of Spain. Philip II tried to enforce Catholicism on the people of the Netherlands, and a lot of people in the Netherlands had already converted to Calvinism. The Dutch revolted against Spanish rule in 1566, and they were led by a guy named William of Orange. They formed the United Provinces of the Dutch Republic with the Union of Utrecht in 1579, and the United Provinces officially became independent after the Treaty of Westphalia after the 30 Years' War. And so they were one of the states opposed to absolutism in the 17th century. So here's just a map so you can better visualize that. So when Charles V abdicated in 1556, he divided his empire, and the blue territory went to the Austrian Habsburgs, and the orange went to the Spanish Habsburgs under Philip II. So you can see that includes Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and then parts of Italy. And so here's the map of the Netherlands as of 1609. The United Provinces, which are in purple, developed a republic. The Spanish Netherlands, which is the southern part, which is basically Belgium and Luxembourg today, remained under the absolute rule of the Spanish king. So just some major characteristics of the Dutch Republic, and these are the numbered parts of your notes. So you can kind of go ahead and fill in the headings, and then we'll go through each one and talk about it. So the Dutch had a republic, or a republican government, in the midst of an otherwise largely absolutist Europe. Number two, they had a stable and thriving economy. We kind of already learned about that when we talked about exploration, but we're going to go even deeper into that. They had religious toleration, and we'll look at some examples of that. The Dutch had a lot of them had converted to Calvinism, but they were also open, or at least tolerant, to some other religions. Number four, they were also open to new intellectual or scientific thought. And it's also a period of the golden age of Dutch painting, and we'll look at a lot of examples of artistic activity. So first, let's talk about the government of the Dutch Republic. Each province of the Dutch Republic was governed locally by an assembly called the state. So the state is a local assembly that had delegates from the different areas. The states were dominated by an oligarchy of wealthy merchants, which in the Netherlands they were called burghers, who served as regents. So for regents, you can say the wealthy merchants dominated the government. And an oligarchy means rule by a few. So what that's basically saying is, even though they didn't have a monarch and they didn't really have a lot of hereditary nobility, there was still a group at the top who was wealthy who dominated the society. So representatives from each state went to the States General. So the States General is a national assembly that implemented provincial decisions. So it's sort of like they got together for things that they had to do nationally, such as foreign policy, but otherwise they tried to keep a lot of the decision making at the local level. And they also had governors who were called stadholders. Governors were local executives in charge of order and defense. Holland, a lot of times people use the term Holland and the Netherlands interchangeably, but Holland is actually one of the provinces of the Netherlands. It was the largest and most populous, and so they were kind of the informal leader of the Netherlands, especially in foreign policy. The Orange family, or the House of Orange, was just a really well-known family who dominated Dutch politics. So for a role of House of Orange, you can say they controlled the position of stadtholder in several provinces. They eventually tried to create a hereditary monarchy, which was not successful, but you'll also hear that term when we start talking about England, which you probably have already read about, that there was a William of Orange who invaded England during the Glorious Revolution and became King of England. So this is a very political family that came from the Netherlands. The Dutch had a different economy than a lot of the rest of Europe. They had higher wages than the rest of Europe, even for women, and we're going to see some artwork that shows that women were really involved in the economy. As an example of this, they ate varied diets, including meat, fish, and cheese, whereas most Europeans at the time, grain was their primary food group. So this really shows that the Dutch were much more prosperous than the rest of the Europeans. And they had access to lots of colonial products, such as sugar, coffee, tea, and spices. The Dutch were noted for their charity, so they organized to take care of the poor, which was not a really common thing in Europe at the time. In general, people looked at the poor as it was kind of like their fault that they were poor. And compared to the rest of Europe, the commercial aristocracy, the kind of these new elites who became wealthy by being merchants, had a lot of power. Protestant moderation. So even though Protestantism said that it was okay to make money and to be wealthy and that was like a sign of God's favor, it also kind of was against showing off. And so we'll see examples of that as we look through this PowerPoint as well. So global trade had a huge impact on the Dutch economy. Like I said before, they had lots of colonial products. And if you want to, you can put down some of the places where they had colonies or access to trade. So if you look at the area of Southeast Asia, they had a lot of islands there for products like spices and other exotic products. New Netherlands they had for a while in North America, which eventually became New York when it was taken over by the British. They also had colonies in South America, a little bit in South Africa. So they had access to products from all over the world. Here are just some examples of that. So the map shows the area that the Dutch controlled, which again became New York after it was taken over by the British. The top is a painting from a Dutch artist. So they had a lot of exotic themes in their art as a result of all the contact that the Dutch had with people from other cultures. The bottom is actually a Japanese print of a Dutch ship, just showing like how common their ships were throughout the world, that this would actually be the subject of art of another culture. And the Dutch were also really known for their ceramics, which I'll show you in a minute, but here's an example of that at the bottom. By the 1630s, the Dutch had 2,500 ships, which controlled half of Europe's shipping. And the Dutch were able to build ships very, very quickly. This is an illustration of the shipyard of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch ship, which became really popular for transporting goods, was called the Vloot. And this is different than other ships at the time because it was made especially to carry products, whereas a lot of other ships were military ships that were converted to cargo ships. And you might remember that Peter the Great spent time in the Netherlands learning about their shipbuilding because it was so impressive. The Dutch also figured out ways to be innovative in agriculture. So the map up here shows the area in blue is area of the Netherlands that really should be below water, but the Dutch figured out a lot of ways to deal with this. One thing that you might remember from geography class is polders and dikes. So they they found a way to reclaim land. And the dikes is like kind of like a dam or like a mound of dirt, which you see here. There's like a canal, and then there's a big bank, and then there's land off to the side. So the reclaimed land, the land that they're able to use because of this system, are called polders. So they really reclaimed a lot of land, even though they're a relatively small country, to use that for agriculture. And we learned this previously, but the Dutch also had the first stock market in Europe, which is called the Bourse. Another thing that the Dutch are known for are their tulips, and I'm going to post this video separately that you can watch if you'd like to. But there was a huge investment bubble in the Netherlands surrounding tulips, which you can watch that video and learn a little bit about that. And Dutch art really reflects the fact that it was such a thriving economy. So this painting will make sense after you watch the tulip video, but it basically is showing people fighting over these tulips, and it's displaying the people as if they're monkeys. So it's really a satire on, or a commentary on, the fact that people were unloading all this money to buy these tulips, and then the bubble burst and they were worth nothing. There's a lot of art that was also commissioned to represent different economic organizations. So guilds under manufacturing and industry, you can say that guilds were important. So here's a painting by Rembrandt of the Drapers Guild. A lot of the cities also built canal systems. So here's a picture of Amsterdam and their canals that they built to be able to move products and people throughout the city very easily. And so here's a typical picture of Amsterdam along a canal, and originally the canals would have been right up against the buildings. Today there's a street there. But a lot of these older Dutch homes have these posts coming out from the top, and they have hooks. And this would have been used as a pulley system to load and unload boats. Because a lot of these Dutch homes, you can see they're built like very vertical. The ground floor was a shop, and then the middle floors were the family area, and then the top floors were storage. And so they have these posts so that they could really easily unload their goods up into the storage area. Another thing you can put down is that women were very involved in the economy. So here's a couple paintings showing this one called The Lace Maker. Here's another one called The Lace Maker. So they were also really known for their textile production. This one, The Account Keeper, so this woman keeping the books. Here's one called Woman Holding a Balance, and she's weighing out like precious jewels and possibly gold. And just think about it, what it says as about their culture, if these are the subjects of paintings. So the economy is just something that is vital to everyone's life, and industry actually becomes a common subject of paintings that people would want to have in their home. The Dutch are also really known for their blue and white pottery. Delft is the area that is most famous for that, which is what this painting is of. And here are some examples. So this was a really popular product from the Netherlands. Here's some other major industries: herring, which is a type of fish, textiles, sugar and tobacco products, glass, beer, paper and books, jewelry, leather goods, and military supplies. So the Dutch had a tremendous amount of manufacturing as compared to a lot of other countries in Europe at the same time. Whereas a lot of other countries were focused solely on agriculture, the Dutch were really producing a lot of manufactured products. All right, the Dutch were also really known for their religious toleration. And so one of the things on your notes here is religious refugees. Where were religious refugees coming from? Well, one of the areas they're coming from was from France. And so you probably remember all the conflicts between the monarchy and the Huguenots of France. And after the Edict of Fontainebleau, a lot of Huguenots left the country. And so those people fled to the Netherlands, a lot of them, because the Netherlands borders part of France. Overall, the Dutch were mostly Calvinists. So Dutch state religion, most of them accepted Calvinism. And just some characteristics kind of associated with that is that Calvinism preached that all occupations had merit. Like, as long as you are doing your job to the best of your ability, you can honor God with your job. They also promoted self-restraint. So you might remember John Calvin's Geneva, how he had all those rules around morality. So self-restraint was something, and not being overly showy was something that the Dutch really valued. And another thing that Calvinism recognized is that money making was okay. Whereas before the Reformation, the Catholic Church had kind of looked down on that and had, for example, banned usury or lending money with interest. The Calvinists tended to say that having wealth was a sign of God's favor. And along with this idea of self-restraint and wanting to kind of distinguish themselves from the Catholics, here's a painting of the interior of a Dutch Protestant church. And I know to us today, this still looks like pretty fancy, but it's very plain compared to the Catholic cathedrals of Europe with like all their stained glass and statues. There's not really a lot of religious images here. It's much more of a plain interior, which is what the Calvinists wanted their churches to be like. They didn't want anything to distract from the worship of God. Here's another illustration of a church that's even more plain. So you can see very simple on the inside, sometimes maybe had a cross at the front, but other than that, your focus was supposed to be all on God and on the person, on the pastor preaching. The Dutch also allowed other religions to practice. So in terms of religious toleration, they really viewed religion as more of a private matter instead of a public matter. So other religions like Catholicism and Judaism were not really practiced real out in the open, but they were tolerated. So they kind of felt like whatever you do behind closed doors, that's up to you. It doesn't, need to be a matter of public record what church you attend. So they were hidden, in quotation marks, hidden churches where people worshipped of other religions, like in people's homes, less in the public eye. Here's a painting, interior of a Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. So again, Judaism was another one of the religions that was tolerated. And here's a portrait by Rembrandt called Portrait of an Old Jewish Man, again, showing that the Dutch accepted people from other faiths besides Calvinism. And like I said, one of the central ideas of Calvinism was the idea of self-restraint. And even though the Dutch were very wealthy, they looked down upon people that had no self-control or real showy or misused their resources. So here are two paintings by Jan Steen, where he's kind of showing what happens with excessive wealth, like the dangers of it. So here, the parents, they look kind of like they're drunk. There's animals eating food off the floor. Nobody's paying attention to the children. There's a dog on the table eating their dinner. So there was a series of paintings like this that kind of warned against the idea of excess in people's lives. Here's another one that's very, very similar. The Dutch were also open to new intellectual thought and science. And we haven't learned about the scientific revolution yet, but we will soon. And we'll see that there were a lot of discoveries happening at this time. So people that you've probably heard about, like Galileo and Nicholas Copernicus and René Descartes and all these people were coming up with all these new ideas. And that was really welcomed in the Netherlands. Part of that is because they didn't have an absolutist state. People had more freedom of speech than in other parts of Europe, and they also had more freedom of the press. So whereas Galileo got in trouble with the Catholic Church for promoting these new ideas about the universe, in the Netherlands, there was not as much restrictions on sharing that kind of information or printing that kind of information. So they became a major center of bookmaking. The Netherlands also had a wide variety of newspapers, so it was a lot more sharing of information. Just as an example of that, the University of Leiden, this was founded in 1575. By 1645, it was the largest Protestant university in the world. And because they also had a non-absolutist state and a more decentralized government, that also kind of hindered the government or the church from having too much control over education. So education was a lot more secular, and an interest in science was much more acceptable. Rene Descartes, who we're going to learn about soon in the scientific revolution, lived in Leiden for a period of time. He was French, but France, we know, was under a lot of restrictions, and so there were a lot of people, scientists and philosophers from France and other absolutist states, who fled elsewhere. Here's just some more examples. You don't need to know these names, but the telescope used to discover Saturn's rings, studies about the wave theory of light were just some of the achievements of Dutch scholars. An early microscope, the discovery of microorganisms are some other examples. Here's another painting by Rembrandt that's really famous, the Anatomy Lecture. And you can see here they're actually dissecting a dead cadaver. Again, just a really unusual subject for painting at the time, in addition to the industry paintings we looked at before. But it really shows the values of the Dutch people, that they value industriousness, manufacturing, scientific study, all of these things. Another thing I'll point out in this painting is that you can see all these men are dressed in plain black clothing with white collars. That really shows this Calvinist idea that the Dutch were known for as well, where they didn't want to be overly showy or ostentatious with their dress. That was considered like a real negative thing, and like you're not a moral person. And so they tended to have real conservative dress. Here's a close-up of that, again showing their interest in science and human anatomy. And again, more paintings, this time by Vermeer, that show that. So this one called The Astronomer, this one called The Geographer. And we'll finish up tomorrow by talking more about Dutch art, and we'll do the painting that you have on your notes, The Night Watch by Rembrandt. But if you think about the paintings that we've seen here, the subject matter is just very different than what we've seen in other parts of Europe. And so we'll talk more about that tomorrow.